Good afternoon. I am Feng Hu, Dean of Arts and Sciences, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the final event of our 2021 Power of Arts and Sciences Week. Over the past 5 days, we have celebrated the convergence that defines us, the creativity that drives us, and the community that inspires us. Our events this year were motivated by our new strategic plan, which was made public on Monday. In the plan, we define an exciting shared vision for the next 10 years. If you haven't had a chance yet, I hope you will take a moment to look through it. I am sure you'll be inspired by our vision for the years ahead. One of the priorities we name in the strategic plan is to connect our work with our community and society. Today's event is a perfect example of this. You'll be hearing about some innovative research happening within arts and sciences and how the findings may be related to your daily life. We're so fortunate to have Dr. Larry Meyer with us today to introduce the speaker and moderate the discussion. Larry is a distinguished economist who served as a faculty member at Washington University for 27 years, including 3 years as chair of the economics department. During his tenure, he launched a consulting firm with 2 of his former students. The company, which used emerging computer technology to provide low-cost macroeconomic modeling services, quickly developed a reputation for its forecasting accuracy, and Larry was recognized as a leading economic forecaster by Business Week. In 1996, he left the university after he was confirmed as a member of the Federal Reserve System's Board of Governors. He served in the role until 2002. He's currently president of Monetary Policy Analytics, a Washington, D.C. advisory firm that he founded in 2016. The firm focuses on global macroeconomics and monetary policy. In 2018, Larry and his wife, Florence, made a generous commitment to establish an endowed professorship in arts and sciences. Throughout their many years of affiliation with the university, they have also provided gifts for scholarships and overarching support for arts and sciences. Larry, thank you so much for your commitment to our school and for joining us today. The floor is yours now.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Hu. And I'm really pleased to be here today, in part because this is part of the program for the Power of Arts and Sciences Week. I am a great proponent of an arts and sciences education. I always tell, particularly parents, that there's nothing that prepares a student more for a broad range of opportunities after graduation and for a better quality of life than an arts and sciences education. And when I think about the power of arts and sciences, I think about the faculty as teachers and as scholars and the value of their research. And that brings me to Professor Gayle. Now, Professor Gayle received his bachelor's and master's degrees in economics from the University of West Indies and his PhD from the University of Pittsburgh. But what's important about George is that he came to Washington University in 2012, after 9 years at Carnegie Mellon University. Now, in preparing for this lecture, I really meant to ask the dean why he selected George among many, many faculty in arts and sciences to present on his research today. And to this broader Washington University community. So perhaps it's because George's research would be particularly interesting to this group. And because his research helps us to understand what's going on around us today in the pandemic, and to potentially understand the long-lasting consequences this pandemic will have. Now, to prepare for this introduction, I also talked to George, and I asked him to tell me what his focus of his research was. And he said, labor economics. And I said, George, that's way too general, okay? That's not gonna mean anything to your audience here. So I told him what I thought his research focus was. And, we're a world of specialists. As an academic, you don't get a high status from being a labor economist. You do from a narrower set of research. And I think that as a labor economist, one of his specialties is on looking at the disparities in labor market outcomes across racial, ethnic, and gender groups. And one of the things that I find particularly important is his focus on the intergenerational persistence in education. And if you look at this pandemic, one of the most troublesome aspects we know is how it's affected the education of our children and what the potential long-lasting effects that might have. I take broadly his research as making a contribution to something I have long focused on, and that's the intergenerational persistence in poverty. So I hope I piqued the interest of your audience in your presentation, and I'm now going to turn the mic over to George.
Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for showing up today. I'm going to thank Larry for those kind words and for helping me market myself better. Today, I'm going to talk about some work we've been doing and the pandemic, and I just want to get to share my screen first. The pandemic. And more importantly, I want to talk about the disparity in the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on employment, human capital accumulation, and consumption. And this is some joint work that is being done by myself and our current graduate student, Andrea Flores. And what we're going to be doing today in this paper and this presentation is that we're going to take a very comprehensive approach to investigate the interrelationship among disparities that has been brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to look something that people have talked about a lot on employment, the losses in income and the reason for the losses of the income here. And in the bigger paper, we'll also look at how it impacts and how these different disparities impact the educational outcome of children and how it affects their access to learning and their access to educational resources. So we also look at the households' consumption behavior and how their spending sources change throughout the pandemic and how their use of social assistance programs change, and the impact that these different programs or different policies had on their spending behavior. Today we only have 30 minutes, and I always take the approach that it's better to learn something about one part instead of learning a lot of things about nothing. So I'm going to focus a lot on the employment impact today, and in my conclusion, I'll wrap it up by basically telling you some of the implications on the children education and household consumption, and refer you to the paper which can be found on our websites. So what are we going to do today? We are going to use data. So this is going to be a very data intensive exercise in which we are going to be presenting a bunch of what I would like to call stylized facts, and check whether these stylized facts are robust to different controls, and see whether or not the effect that we see on different racial groups are mediated through other channels that we may be not thinking of. So at the start of the pandemic, the US Census Bureau started a survey called the Pulse Survey, and the Pulse Survey spans the period from April 23rd, 2020, right at the 1 month into the pandemic in the US, to August 30, 2021, basically the time we went back to in-person teaching at Washington University. And it contains information on a lot of things, but one of the important things that we are going to look at that it contains information on is employment, the educational arrangement for children, and consumption during the pandemic. This survey has a lot of information, but it was focused mostly on things that had to do with the pandemic and didn't have much to say of what happened before the pandemic. So we are going to supplement this pulse data, as we're going to call it, by data from the current population survey from January 19 to August 2021, unemployment outcome, so that we can compare some pre-trends and to see whether or not the trends that we see in the pulse survey was a breaking of the trend that was going on or a continuation of things that was going on before. We're going to do the same thing for food security supplement. We're going to go a little bit further back and to I think December 2019, and we're going to look at some of those information there. We're going to also control, because we are going to see a lot of variation across state and different social groups, and so we want to control for the different policy that different states brought into being when they were responding to the pandemic. So we are going to have state level information on COVID-19 cases. From the tracker, we're going to have the CDC surveillance data. We are going to merge all of those data together. And finally, we are going to have some measure of how much in a lockdown or mobility was impacted at different geographical region. We are going to use it at the state level in this analysis. And those data are going to be drawn from Google's mobile report, which basically track cell phone activity before and after the pandemic. So to start, I'm going to start by looking at the reasons for the employment loss, or the fraction of people who experience an employment loss when the pandemic hit, and the continuation. So we have both things in the first couple of weeks, we have things that continue throughout, and this is basically summarizing it. And I want to focus, as Dr. Maya pointed out, my focus is on disparity between different groups. So I want to look at disparity between the education, the highest level of education completed for the household member that were responding to the survey at the time. I'm going to categorize them, just for presentation's sake, into 4 broad categories. People who have a college education, graduate and above, I'm going to call that college plus. People who have graduated from high school and have at least 2 years of college education, I'm just going to call that some college. And high school graduates, high school, and what I'm going to call high school dropouts here. And the first thing that you're going to notice is that there is a non-monotonic relationship between education and job loss. So if you look at people who dropped out of high school, the job loss during the pandemic was around 60%. About 60% of the individuals have lost some income, the households have lost some income because of the pandemic, or because during the pandemic. And that went down to about 50% for people with high schools. We see this bumping back up for people who have at least a high school degree plus a year of college, but not a college degree. And this went down to about 40% for the college educated. So as we see very early, that there is a big education gradient in how the pandemic affected individuals in terms of the income they lost due to loss in employment here. The next group here, basically, I wanted to figure out, is this number that we're seeing here, is this because of composition effect? Is it because these guys sought into different things? And is it because of the household characteristic, the state that they were living in, and so forth. So we are going to do a regression analysis. We're just thinking about this as an analysis in which we are going to control for household income. We're going to control for the respondent's age. We're going to control for the state level mobility changes. We're going to control for how bad was the pandemic in your particular state. And we are going to look at whether or not these overall trend that I just pointed out on the graphs still hold, right? And what the answer is, yes, they still hold, right? I mean that non-graduates were more likely than college graduates were more likely than college graduates to lose income from the pandemic. It was slightly higher for households with some college, as we saw before, and it's around 7.5% for some college, around 3.5% for high school, 4.7% for high school dropout. So even after controlling for what you were doing before, household income, we still see that the education that you have at your highest level of education was protective in a way against job loss throughout the pandemic here, or income loss due to the pandemic. The question, however, is what does this, why is it that when I look up here, I see 60% once I control for some of the characteristics such as household income, this goes down to 7.5%, right? So it's obvious that some of the impact is being mediated through race, education, and also through income. So I'm going to focus on income for a minute. So I'm going to try to understand how this gradient plays out over income. And what I'm going to look at is that I'm going to look at income before the pandemic, and we're going to basically sort households according to the income distribution that they have during the pandemic, pre-pandemic. And we're going to look at the bottom. We are going to look at the top quintile and the second, third, and fourth quintile of the income distribution we're going to look at here. So what we are going to see is it's very monotonic in terms of, from the bottom to the top, right? It's like 58% of them in the bottom lost income, and that dropped to only about, I would say 32% in the top income quintile here, right? So the issue is, what happened in this income, if you look at it by income distribution, and here we're going to not control for household income, but now we're going to control for age, and we're going to control for state level mobility. We're going to control for the average number of new COVID case, death, and we're going to see what happened to that income gradient, right? So the income gradient was not because of state, right? There was some effect because there's some correlation between education and income. But even over and above education, within the same education group, if people in the bottom quintile was still going to have 20.2% more likely to experience an income loss than people in the top 10%. And so now I want to turn to another aspect, which is the race, right? So we're going to think, what was the distribution looking like, the income loss due to non-employment by race? And what you can see is that you see this gradient again, right? There's substantial differences by race, okay? And this is what you have heard in the news, this is what you have heard in many writing, is that, if you look at the people who have lost income, white, and the raw data is losing about 42% of whites, and go up to about 43%, 53% for blacks, and almost 60% for Hispanics here. So one of the things that we want to basically do then is, again, control for these different things and see whether or not these racial differences persist. Is it because we have overrepresentation of different ethnic groups by income distribution? We know all about how the inequality in earnings is correlated with race. Is it because of state? We know that there are geographical variation in state. Is it because different states was hit with different level of COVID death and incident at a given time? And the answer is it still persists, and it's still a significant in terms of the differences, but there still is a racial gap, and it is still highest for Hispanic and lowest in terms of it relative to whites for blacks here. Right? So in terms of losing income, we see three things that we can take away. Is that college education was protective, right? Our education in general was protective. Second is that there are significant variation over and above your education level by income. And third, that there are significant variation by the race of the individual, controlling for mobility, states level variation, and occupation, what we're going to do later on. So the question then becomes why? And one of the big things that happened through this pandemic, and something that labor economists like myself has to get a hand on, is the fact that there was a massive shift in the way that we worked, right? So what happened is that we had, all of us in March 15, March 16, and WashU, we had to rejiggle and we had to get ready to go from in-person teaching to online teaching. But we were not special. Right? There were individuals doing that all over the country, and it still persists today in terms of the level of people switching from in-person work to either telecommuting and so forth. So what I'm going to have here, what was the nice thing about the Pulse here, is that the Pulse was asked question about the change in adults' work arrangement at the onset of the pandemic and how that persists over time as we move forward. So again, I'm going to be looking at this from by education group, the same education group I defined before. I call them less than high school, some college, and plus. These are highest level of education. And what I'm going to be looking at my y-axis is just a fraction of households that change their work arrangement since the onset of the pandemic. Okay, and my blue line is our bar is going to be when you have an adult, at least one adult in the household switch from in-person to telework. My orange here is going to be no adult switch to in-person to telework. And the next one is they were working already in telework, and there were no change. There was no change to telework here. Right. So what we can see again, if we just look at the blue one bar here, we can see this gradient is that people who were college educated were shift a lot more to telework. And this may be one reason why we saw that college education was so protective against income loss, right? So if you look here, is that the ability to do that is like was 15% of high school dropouts were able to switch. So no wonder they lost so much jobs, because they weren't able to switch and continue to work. More than 60% of college graduates switch to telework. And this persists even with the control for everything, control for all the different controls that we have in the data. This persists here. So one of the reasons that we can think about why we see this protectiveness of college education or higher education was the ability for them to switch from in-person work when the pandemic hit to telework here. And the income distribution is the same, almost the same thing. The gradient is even sharper when you look from the income distribution, right? So if you look at the income distributions, the people in the bottom was 13% of them were able to switch. And that went up to approximately 70% of the families in the top quintile of the income distribution was able to switch from in-person work to telework as the impact of the pandemic comes. And again, controlling for everything, we're basically seeing that these things persist here. We still see this persistent grading. For race, it's not as clear cut, right? In the sense that there is a race gradient, in the sense that if we notice like 30%, 33% of Blacks and Hispanics, almost equivalent, was able to switch. And it is true that 45% of whites were able to switch here. And here again, when we control for income, control for the age, the state mobility level, and all of these different things, these things eliminate. So one of the things that, in terms of just looking at race, and this is the first time we've seen this here, is that there wasn't much difference by race to begin with. And once you control for income and age, that difference basically disappears, right? That difference basically disappears. Most of the differences that we see in the change in arrangement for race was driven by the correlation between income, education, and race, right? So education and income was protective. And it wasn't that educated Blacks were not able to switch, or educated Hispanics were not able to. They switched in equal amount, and so we don't see a big impact on race in terms of the arrangement that we basically have here. Okay, so that brings us to the other category I'm going to look at in employment here. And that category is, I want to figure out, and there's a lot of talk about, why is it that we don't see the unemployment rate or people coming back into the labor market as before? And everybody has their favorite pet theory. The data allow us to actually explore this. And the reason why is that we have data from, as I said, April 2020 to August 2021, and we can track the reason why somebody was out of work. So we're going to look at reasons for non-employment here, and I'm going to say non-employment, which is a much broader concept than unemployment, in the sense that even if you're not looking for a job, and once you used to work, you'll be counted here. So this is a much broader concept that I'm going to be looking at here. And I'm going to explore how these change by different socioeconomic groups, but I'm also going to start to look at how it changed by family structure, right? The number of kids you have, married versus not married, gender, and so forth. Because as we have seen in the raw data, or even in some of the aggregate statistics, these things seem to matter. And depending on your favorite theory as to why people are not working, whether it is just, people are just quitting because they are what they call the great resignation in the media, or is it because of the fact that the schooling hasn't come back, and those have these different impact here. So they asked all the people who were not working at each pulse survey the reason why they were not working. And so the first one is going to be, okay, I was laid off because my business, furloughed individuals, or closed down because of COVID-19. So that's business closing down because of COVID-19. So how much of that, and how has that progressed over time as we see the ups and downs in the pandemic, the recovery, and the shutdown again that we look at here. The next thing we're going to look at is the reason for this non-employment because you were sick or having COVID-19 symptoms. So you were sick, you have to left your job and so forth. You were not working because of that here. And the third one I'm going to be looking at is something that we talked about a lot in the news and in general in the populace here, is that, is it because you are taking care of children, and how does that vary by gender and marital status and the number of kids that you have? Or is it because if your kids' daycare closed down and you have to provide this service now at home? How is that? What's going to happen? So the first one I'm going to start out with the non-employment, because your business for long individuals because are laid off individuals because of COVID-19 related closes, right? And so what I'm going to have here on my x-axis, I'm going to have the first day of the week for the survey. And the survey, as you can see, is going to start out here on the 7th of the 5th and go all the way up here to 2001 here. And each line is going to be one of the different groups I've looked at. So my orange line is going to be college and above individuals and how they have experienced things over time. My purple line is going to be high school. My blue is going to be less than high school or high school dropout, and my green is going to be some college here. And here I'm looking at the fraction of individuals who are not working because the business closed down in response to COVID-19. And as we have expected, at the beginning, it was very high. But if you can look at the first part here, you can see that it is very high for, less than high school, and college. They were very close together, so around 30% of the individuals who are not working were because they were furlong from the business. This was much lower for college-educated individuals, right? In the sense that that was about 11 to 12% at the beginning, and then we see a decline all the way down to about if you go around here, around 8 to 7% of the total. Notice you see this decline here. And the only separation really, because these bars are basically my confidence interval. So statistically, the only things that are really consistently difference over time is a separation that college and above was protected from this business closing due to responses to the pandemic. Right? So as we expect, we see the gradient. And we expect we see bumps when there were some of the uptakes. We can see these different bumps, and we can see the going down and here, and you can see the same thing and so forth. The one thing that we also can notice from this graph is that individuals who have less than high schools were also experiencing a lot more volatility in the movement to the cases as we have shut down and reopen and shut down and reopen again here. And when you look at the income distribution, now this is by income distribution. So the same y-axis, the same x-axis. The only things that are now is that the lines represent different quantile of the income distribution pre-pandemic. What we see is that we see a nice separation, right? So of course, in the lowest quintile and the second lowest quintile, they're basically the same here. They have around 30 and all the way down to 20%. And the highest quintile is, yes, there was an uptick, but then it basically stayed flat afterwards here. So again, we see the separation, especially, and a lot of it is coming from the business closing. And that had to do, or harkens back to the result I showed you that has to do with teleworking, okay? So now let's look at race. And at race, we see the sharp distinction. It was in the sense that you look at whites and massively lower, and you basically look at Hispanics and Black, and they overlap in this case. So we see this disparity again by race in terms of the response to the business responses, business laying off individuals because of COVID-19. This is kind of different because we're looking at marital status here, and this has to do with the children. We're going to come back to this. We see this big difference between married individuals, our household that have married, and single households again, and it's significant. The trend follow each other. There's not more volatility over time, but we see that there is a shift down for married individuals here. And there's not that much different by gender, right? So there's not much difference by gender here. If we look also by even the number of kids, so it can't be the number of kids. Here, there's no difference. But they have no kid, one child, two children, more than two children. There is not much difference by gender here. So I'm going to now look at exposure. The reason why you're not working is because of exposure to COVID-19. And here we see a big difference in terms, again, by education. If you look at, and this could just behavioral, this could be in terms of people who are wearing masks, especially towards the end vaccination rates and all of these different things. But if you look at the education gradient, again, you'll see that you see the college and above flat here, and you see this massive change here for the less than high school educated or high school dropout, going up when the peaks go down, up again, stay high. And you see that also for high school graduate and also for some college graduate here. Right. If we look at income quintile, we see a similar story here also. And when we look at the race, is that we see this one where you see the whites are much less volatile, and Hispanics are much more volatile here, and in terms of being sick and being exposed to COVID, losing their job because of COVID. I also want to make this point, however, that we're talking about a smaller fraction of the population here, or the non-working population. As I said, you saw before, 30% was because of, or at least at the beginning, close to 30% was because of the business closing, and we are talking about 8 and 6% here. So we're talking about smaller magnitudes here, very much smaller magnitudes in this thing. But there are still differences that we can see here. And again, we see differences here by children. Before we didn't see anything by business, we see by children. This may have to do child going out, bringing it home and stuff like that. People who have more kids actually were more likely to be out. Again, the levels are going to be much smaller. And this is the one that we normally talk about a lot. It's like, I'm at home, I'm not working because I'm taking care of children. And what you can see is that once the pandemic hit, the less than high school, basically 6% of them said they were at home taking care of children because their kids were out of school or did not have daycare. And that hasn't changed, right? And that hasn't changed. What has happened, if you look at for college, it was lower. If anything, it has increased for college educated. And for high school and some college, it's, there some for high school, there's a little bit more volatility, but they're basically flat here. So it seems as if the people saying that they are at home taking care of their kids haven't changed much since the pandemic, in the sense that there was a bump up and it stayed there. So although schools seem to be opening, people are still staying home and not, at least the ones that are staying home are not coming off the sidewalk because of that. And so this is about 6% of the less than high school, and about just around 2% for college, but the biggest part is coming from less than high school. And again, this goes by race, by income quintile. We expect to see the same thing that we have here. By race, we see a similar thing. Blacks are more exposed to this. And marital status, married individuals are more exposed to this than single individuals. And females are much more likely to be staying home because of that than males, which we kind of expect. And people with more kids are doing it more than people with less kids. So we basically see that here. So I just want to summarize what I have talking to. I have 1 minute to go. Is that we had this massive amount of data. We were able to parse it in different ways. We have looked at the display of how these things are revered by race and so forth. And overall, what we find is that there are a lot of income groups or some disparities that vary by race, education, and these different things. And when you control for some things, race goes away. For example, when you look at some of the other things we have control for, occupation and so forth, you see the sickness differences between Hispanics and whites and blacks are going to go away. So they're sorted to different occupation, and different occupation come with different occupational hazard, and that's what the different things. But more overall is just something that we want to take away is that these socioeconomic groups with higher income losses also experience a lot of other bad stuff, right? So they have a higher share of household in which their kids face severe education disparity. So that's going to have huge impact on the intergenerational transmission of education here. They have more restricted resources to education. So in the paper, we look at access to computers, access to the internet. They also have less access to computers, less access to the internet, and they have also experiencing a higher share of people. There are a higher share of people who are experiencing food insecurity, and this is even relative to January 2019 and December 2019, in terms of these big drops that we're going to see here. And secondly, the next thing is that these are also the same individuals that are being locked out from the social security, the social welfare system. In terms of that, they are relying more on alternative source of income to meet their spending needs throughout this pandemic. Although they're applying more to social assistance program, they are also being rejected more. And so they're relying more on alternative here. So in concluding, is just saying that, you know, these disparities that we see in the labor market are translating into disparities into food insecurity, resources for kids, and educational disruption, which means access to educational support, and also they are also being locked out from the social welfare system. Out of time, I thank you guys for coming, and I'll hand you over to Dr. Meyer.
Okay. So I have a few questions. So if you have questions, please submit them, because right here, I only seem to have two. Maybe I'll come up with others. So the first one is, George, do you know of anyone who is doing similar analysis in other countries and whether they are finding anything different?
So there's a bunch of papers that have used data on the UK here, and they haven't really looked. The one for the UK haven't looked at the racial disparities and so forth, but they have looked at income. And some of the trends that some of the trends we've seen in our research is actually showing up in the UK data also. And so we know people are doing it in the UK. I haven't seen anything for Canada or even in developing countries, but I know that there's some work done in the UK, and they're finding, I would say, similar pattern in the things we have looked at. Both of us have looked at. We just are doing a lot more, a bigger SWOT of it, at least what I know here.
Now, the next one I find particularly interesting. What public policy should we focus on in order to minimize these disparities before the pandemic?
So we're talking about public policy before the pandemic. Well, one of the things, I don't know about the public policy before the pandemic, but one of the things that if you look at the paper, what we have shown is that there seem to be that the people who need the social assistance more, while applying for them at a higher rate, are also the ones that are not getting it at a higher rate. So there's something broken in a way in the social assistance program in terms of these different things, is that the application rate is higher, but the receiving rate is lower. And so at least we don't see that. Now, in terms of other social policy before, one of the big ones that we saw in terms of this disparity is literally just the access to schooling. So, you know, school financing reform is up there in terms of what you're gonna have to do to get rid of some of these disparities. And we can have a long debate about the best way to reform school financing and whether the current system, which relies on property tax, is the best and so forth. But a lot of this has to do with where you live and whether or not your school district could have pivot to it. Because if you notice, there's a fraction of individuals who are basically out of the labor force because they don't have access to childcare or the after school program and so forth. And a lot of that is correlated with where you live and whether your school have that. So school reform, finance reform, or equalizing opportunities in terms of schooling is going to be important if we're going to deal with these disparities, and also for the intergenerational transmission of those things too.
Did you say that you control for age? I wonder if the difference in married versus single is because of age. Younger people are less likely to be married in lower paying jobs, at businesses more likely to need to close.
So we did control for age, and we did see the marital thing still there. So we still, the thing that matters a lot more than age is occupation. It's how people select into the different occupation. So a lot, for example, other things that we see with Hispanics in terms of, having higher rates of COVID, are because of unemployment because of COVID. Occupation matters, right? So that's where most of that is coming from. People are, the type of work you do, the type of jobs you do, that matters. In terms of the marriage, that still persists, even after controlling for age. So I understand young people are much more likely to be single, but we do control for age in the pulse regressions that we do.
What is something tangible we could do as a society to be in a better position when the next pandemic or major work disruption happens?
I think we go back to the two things I talked about before. You have to have the access to the education at the bottom in terms of the resources at the different school districts, and so forth. And the second one is we had a social welfare system that seems not to be working in delivering the benefit as it should. So then this has nothing to do with whether it's passed by Congress or not. This is just literally how it's administrated at the state level. And one of the problems that you're seeing there is that states with a higher fraction of minority and poor are much more stringent in their requirement for getting social assistance. And states that has less, have more educated individuals and stuff like that have much more lenient rules. And that is causing one of these, when the shock comes, they apply more, but they don't get it. And a lot of that has to do with the variation in how different states is administering the social welfare program.
Do you envision these gaps increasing as school districts continue to rely on remote learning for things like snow days, sick days, and in response to future health crises?
So there's some good news about this though. We're moving towards the end, and we didn't get to go into all of this thing. We didn't look at it. So when you look at the resources, in terms of the access to computers, whether or not you had internet and all of these different things, those differences were really large at the beginning of the pandemic. Okay, and towards the September 2020, those gaps started to shrink. And they continue to shrink. And by August 2021, which is the end of the pulse survey, a lot of those gaps are almost disappeared. So at least there are the poor individuals somehow seem to be getting access to computers, access to internet, and so that disparity is gone. The thing that hasn't gone away completely is the fact that poor school districts canceled classes while rich school districts switched to remote learning. And that difference, I think, is still there. So we're gonna have to find a way to deal with that.
why do you think that Hispanic employees were out of work due to COVID symptoms at such a higher rate than other groups?
Occupation. Once you control for occupation, that goes away. They were working in occupation that are exposed to COVID at a lot higher rate. That is definite. It's like you look at the occupation. Once you control for the occupation that they're in, that difference goes away. That difference goes away.
And do you have any sense of how these economic disparities vary by region? For example, urban versus rural communities. And how does St. Louis stack up?
Yeah, right. We don't have, the pulse is not that big that we can go down to the level of St. Louis. But yes, yeah, I think so. We did do the urban versus rural, and I cannot remember off the top of my head because the fact that it didn't make it to the paper mean that there weren't much difference between them. And we also did by region. And again, it didn't. And region is talking about north, east, southeast, and so forth. We do control for state, so everything here is netting out the impact of state. But it didn't make the final cut of the paper, and I'm assuming it's because we didn't find much difference between when you look by regions here. But we could look back at the garbage bin to see whether or not those results are there.
Are there historical analogs in the US or elsewhere for this type of major work disruption and its double or triple whammy effects?
I'm not a historian, and we should have the power of art and science and bring over a historian to answer that question. But my colleagues in history, I bet you that they could find other episodes where these different things happen. Was the responses the same as we're seeing now? I do not know, and that's something that we'll have to explore. And that's the power of art and science for you there.
Okay, so I think this is the last question, and it's for you, not for me, okay? How did the disparities play in the macroeconomics of our country? Is it in any way related to inflation?
I don't think we know well. The jury's out as to whether or not it has to do with inflation. Inflation had to a lot of people tell that inflation had to do with the supply chain impact and the different things. In terms of the macroeconomy, we basically have two different economies going on. So, as you can see, there is, one for the college educated and one for the not. So if you think about it, it's kind of this, what we'd call a K recovery, right? The bottom kind of kicked out, as my colleague, Youngshin, in econ would say, and the top went up. So that is increasing inequality, right? In the sense, in terms of that. And it cannot give us false sense of security in terms of what we're going on and who is getting it and not, who have recovered and whose economy has not recovered. And so those have definitely impact, but I don't see how the disparity between race and so forth necessarily plays directly into inflation here.
Okay, George, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation, and I thank the audience for their really, really interesting questions. So now I turn it over to the Dean, I think.
Thank you, Larry and George, for such a thought-provoking presentation. I also want to thank everyone for joining us to celebrate the power of arts and sciences. As I mentioned earlier, our new strategic plan was just made public, and we would like to end today's event by sharing a video that celebrates our new vision for arts and sciences. A link to the strategic plan website is also in the chat. Thank you again for your time and attention. Enjoy your evening and have a great weekend.
Our campus sits near the confluence of two ancient rivers. Ecosystems merge and thrive in our midst. Our region has seen diverse cultures take root, fight for survival, and reach toward greatness. A host of resources, historical and cultural, innovative and intellectual, enrich our work. They draw us to engage with our city, with each other, and with communities around the globe. Our school, Arts and Sciences, represents a convergence of ideas that shape our understanding of the world, and indeed the world itself. We will elevate scholarship that is creative and ambitious by embracing new ideas, emerging technologies, and shifting paradigms. We will honor and promote the pursuit and discovery of knowledge. We will seek distinction in cutting-edge scholarship and push boundaries both within and among disciplines to meet the most critical challenges facing our communities and our planet. We will find new ways to tell our story, to share the matter and meaning behind our work. We are an institution devoted to bringing people together to serve the public good. Our partnerships here in St. Louis and across the region will identify shared goals, and we will pursue academic and educational excellence that positively impacts our communities.
We will forge critical connections
From the local to the global,
expanding solutions.
and imparting lasting impacts on the world.
within our own community.
Faculty, staff, and students
of all identities will feel valued,
represented, and equally empowered to pursue their goals.
Here, we will create
meaningful connections
with our peers,
our mentors,
and the St. Louis community.
We will gather knowledge
and learn how to apply it
to build lives
filled with meaning and purpose.
We will go out into the world
as engaged,
active,
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 and impactful members of our communities.
Together, our voices will rise to shape the next decade and all the decades to come. We are ready. The time is now. Welcome to the Decade of Arts and Sciences.